Okay. Please know that this webinar is being recorded. It is not capturing individual attendee information. And it will be, we're recording it so that we can post it on our YouTube, so that even more folks can see it as needed. And welcome everyone. We're really glad you're here.
Again, welcome, beautiful community and allies. This is the information session on U.S. passports and other documents, current as of February 5th of 2025, which is very important because, as I noted while preparing this, I referenced early on in this process, which was only 2.5 weeks ago at this point. So things are changing very quickly. Before we even introduce ourselves, I really want to welcome everyone. I want to remind all of the trans and non-binary folks who are joining us tonight that you are beautiful and perfect and whole, and that no document can tell you anything otherwise, no matter what that document reflects. You are our friends, and you are our community, and you are our family. We stand with you, and we will fight to protect you, as so many others have previously and are going to continue to do. My name's Keita St. John. I am a cis queer attorney who's practiced for 19 years in Washington State. I am very much a trans and non-binary ally, and I'm very deeply in community and family with trans and non-binary folks. Denise and I are both volunteer attorneys with the QLaw Foundation, which is an LGBTQIA2S+ legal organization in Washington State. And I personally have practiced over 19 years, I think I said now, in the areas of criminal defense, protection orders, as well as family formation and protections for LGBTQIA2S+ folks. And I helped found the QLaw Foundation Legal Clinic 16 years ago, and I have volunteered with the QLaw Foundation ever since. Denise.
Hi, everybody. I'm Denise Diskin. I am also an attorney here in Washington. I have the great and deep privilege to have been a cisgender person. I use she, her pronouns, who, when I came out as queer 25 years ago, came out into a community that was like 60 to 70% trans, non-binary, and intersex folks. And so I really was raised up as a queer person by trans, non-binary, intersex folks, by y'all, and have really, you all are really my community, my loved ones, my family. And so it's my honor to use the skills that I have and the relative distance that I have from this work and from the impacts of this to try and interpret the chaos of what's happening and to stand with you as we all navigate it together. I do, just to kind of share what skin I have in the game, I do have very close family members that are trans, including family members to the degree of like, it matters very much to me and to our household what their passport status is. So this is an issue to me that's not just academic, but also really personal. And so just really appreciate you all and the love and mentorship and community that we all build together and that we've built together for a long time. I did want to share one thing, which is that Keita and I are here as volunteers. We both have day jobs that are not this, although I did formerly work for QLaw Foundation until last fall. And most of the vast majority of lawyers who are doing the research, the day-to-day support for folks who are in your position are also volunteers. And I just want to share that, like, for this information, there's no like special lawyer hive mind. It's not like there's a bulletin that goes out to lawyers that's like, here's an update on what's happening and here's how to interpret it. Like, we get our information from the news just like you guys do. Um, and um, and I also want to say, we often see national civil rights organizations taking on these big cases. and that each of you who are navigating these issues are just as valuable and valid as and brave as any of those, sort of national civil rights plaintiffs that are part of the big cases, right? Um, the stuff that happens in our community, it's not the stuff that happens in the big cases. It's not the stuff that happens at the Supreme Court. It has always been what we do for each other and how we treat each other. Um, I do want to share that organizations like QLaw Foundation that are, very local based and in close relationship with our communities really, really need your support right now. Unfortunately, 2024 was a really hard fundraising year for pretty much every organization doing this work. And as funders feel pressure to um, cut our communities out, feel the pressure from the federal government to cut back on how they support us. We're going to be increasingly relying on individual donors, which is people just like you. So we hope that if you feel like this webinar is helpful and QLaw Foundation's advocacy, the things that we do for inclusive schools, access to gender affirming healthcare, 15 years of free legal clinics, that meeting the legal needs of thousands of Washingtonians. If you feel like that's helped you, we hope that you'll consider making a donation that is meaningful to you, and we'll drop a link to the chat. So please forgive me for starting us with that pitch, but it really is so essential right now that the organizations doing this work have the resources that we need, and every little bit helps, whether it's a little monthly or a one-time donation. Anything like that helps because it keeps us going. So thank you all very much. And Kita, it is your turn. What are we going to cover tonight?
So this slide is the overall agenda. I do want to note that the current administration is targeting trans and non-binary folks, not because there is anything wrong with trans and non-binary folks, but because trans and non-binary people in our country are a relatively small population that is often misunderstood by people who have never met a trans person and can't conceive of what that means to them to be trans or non-binary. But it is about 5.5 million people. So do not feel like you're alone. This is, the United States is a big country. Small is still quite a significant number of people. It also, frankly, is the first group that the Trump administration is going to be targeting. I think how we fight back and how we address the issues that are directly impacting quite significantly trans and non-binary people is going to dictate a lot of how we see the current administration addressing other populations to come. Which is why I've been telling everyone, if you don't think that the current administration is coming for you next, you would be wrong. As everyone is well aware, the current administration has issued a lot of discriminatory executive orders against trans and non-binary people. And the good news is that most of them are already being challenged in court by our national legal partners, places like the National Center for Lesbian Rights, GLAAD, the ACLU. We are here tonight to only address the orders regarding identification, namely passports, and then also how that relates to identification from Washington state. We know a lot of you might be from out of state, so you will need to check your own state laws in terms of how identification there will or will not be impacted, because we are, excuse me, attorneys who are barred here in Washington state. It's important that you know what we can and cannot do for you here tonight. And I was going to say, Denise, there we go. I'm not in charge of the slides. What we can do is give you information about what we know. We have pulled this from a lot of different sources, community, attorneys, but also importantly, national partners who are very actively involved in the work of executive orders and in the litigation challenging those orders. So we have been in touch with a variety of national partners to be sure that we're up to date on this information for you. The most important thing that we can't do is tell you what to do for yourself. We can give you this information, but we are not you. We don't know what your safety concerns are, what your risk tolerance is, and what your relationships are in terms of needing to protect other people in your life as well. And we know that for some people, safety means remaining stealth, and that is the highest priority. And that for others, safety means being able to actively and openly resist. And there is no right answer. The right answer is to do what is right for you. I would say, as an ally and as a cis person who is not trans or non-binary, that I do think one right answer is for allies to do all that we can, especially when trans and non-binary folks do not feel safe in doing so. And I would note in particular that we probably have a lot of cisgender parents on here tonight. And I know that you already do so much for your trans and non-binary children, but allies also means you. We need you to be that conduit between yourself and other parents, other community members, to explain what it means to be trans and non-binary so that your child does not necessarily have to. And with that, Denise is going to jump right into what exactly an executive order is. And the most important thing is what it is not.
Yes, so an executive order is not a law. So if you're terminally online like I am, you probably have seen folks saying like, don't comply in advance. What that means is that an executive order is just an instruction to federal agencies. And it's not even a particularly specific set of instructions, because actually the details of the processing about how an agency is going to carry out its work, those details are set by the agencies through rulemaking, and that has some like deadlines and timeframes and comment periods and things like that that are required by statute. And so really the executive branch, when these executive orders that we've seen rolling out are really just sort of declarations, broad declarations of policy. If those orders ask agencies or demand that agencies create rules that violate the Constitution or violate existing federal laws, they can be legally challenged, and they have been legally challenged. So here you see a picture of our brand spanking new Attorney General, Nick Brown, and some of the lawyers that he works with, who almost immediately after January 20th, I think by Thursday of that week, were in federal court here in Seattle, and had gotten a national pause on the executive order about birthright citizenship. The reason that they were able to do that is that the Constitution very clearly states that birthright citizenship is a constitutional right. And the executive order just said, nah. And so in given that sort of very clear interference between what the Constitution says and what the president said to do, a court was able to say very quickly, no, that's not correct. Pause this order because what you're asking people to do is unconstitutional. So these are not permanent executive orders. They are not laws. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. Just as a note for people who care very much about birthright citizenship, I mean, I think Kita mentioned at the beginning that trans folks are one of the first target groups for this administration. The other target group are immigrants, right? And by immigrants, we mean, and I think not we, the administration means people of color, right? And so this, there are these sort of two target groups that were sort of day one priorities. And then we've seen other additional attacks against diversity initiatives and other sort of, initiatives that the federal government has taken on to shift things towards a better situation in our society. But in any case, they are not laws. And one of the big ones, Trump sort of issued two right out the gate that were kind of bangers, right? And one of them immediately got squished. So very proudly by Washington. And then there were 3 other cases around the country as well. Just as a note, that injunction will be heard again for a more longer term injunction to pause the executive order for an even longer period of time tomorrow morning, again here in Seattle. So watch the news. Okay, so more about executive orders. Executive orders are issued by the executive branch, which is the president. What they can do is instruct public-facing agencies about what those public-facing agencies do with the public. So we're going to talk a lot about passports. Passports are governed by the Department of State, and the State Department does a number of functions, but the public-facing function is that they issue and regulate passports. TSA is another public-facing agency that we interact with a lot when we travel, and that agency is receiving instructions from the executive branch to write rules following the new sort of gender limitations that the administration has proposed in its order. Executive orders also impact internal federal functions. So for example, you may see news about federal employees who are having their LGBTQ affinity groups or racial affinity groups disbanded, employees that are being told to remove pronouns from their email signatures, right? So executive orders can impact internal federal functions through the Office of Personnel Management, which is, again, it's an executive order is an instruction to an agency, and then that agency carries out the instruction. And so Office of Personnel Management is that agency carrying out the instruction. Executive orders do not impact the private sector. So when we see Target or other corporations rolling back their DEI initiatives, for example, or when we see organizations taking LGBTQ content out of their programming because of an executive order, they don't have to do that. They're choosing to do that because they're worried that they will experience some kind of consequences from the executive branch if they don't. But they are not legally bound to do those things. They are choosing to do that. So when we hear people say don't comply in advance, that's sort of what we mean. There's a little bit of individual choice to it in terms of like, what we educating ourselves about how we respond to these things. But it's also just like, it's also don't comply in advance is like, dear Target, don't disband your DEI or your LGBTQ work just because somebody, just because the president said so. The president doesn't actually have the power to say so. So that's an important thing for us to know about executive orders, and that is different than laws that Congress passes. Okay, let's see what this specific executive order does. I'll spare you the gory details. I read it so that you don't have to. It's not worth it. But essentially what it does is it places the diversity of gender that we have been able to accomplish through our activism within federal agencies, it places it into a very narrow binary box. What it effectively means is that X-gender markers are no longer being recognized by the federal government. Changed or amended gender markers are no longer being recognized as valid by the federal government, and that there is no acknowledgement of trans, non-binary, or intersex people in federal programs, data, or policies. So when you've seen probably the news about web pages coming down that contain scientific data about our communities, when you've seen things in the news about travel advisory pages being changed from LGBTQ travel advisories to LGB travel advisories, that is that federal instruction to those agencies and to reflect this sort of new normal that the new administration is trying to put into place. Obviously, it doesn't mean that it doesn't change anything about y'all, right? Like the diversity within LGBTQ community and specifically trans, non-binary, intersex and, experiences is as old as humans. So this is just an administrative designation that has profound impact that we're kind of trying to sort out. Essentially, what you can expect is that all federal offices and agencies are going to be reviewing and revising their functions to align with this particular executive order. And we're going to unpack that specifically for some of the core documents that y'all work with and carry with you every day. So I'm going to start with X gender markers on federal documents. So right now, what we know is that the federal government is no longer issuing X gender markers on new federal documents and is no longer issuing X gender markers as a amendment to an existing document. This includes requests for changes that were submitted prior to January 20th. So if you have a pending request for an X gender marker with the federal government, it is likely not going to be processed. And if you are looking at applying for a new federal document, and particularly a passport with an X gender marker, that is also not going to be allowed. What we don't know is what the government's going to do with existing X gender marker passports. So, some of y'all might be holding an X marked passport that you got last year in 2024, right? That's a 10-year document. So theoretically, you should be able to move through the world with your X gender marker until 2034, right? Theoretically. And the State Department has sort of pinky sworn that they will honor any current passports with an X gender markers, any currently issued passports that people are holding. They have said that they will do this and that they will honor prior changes. Now, we know that this administration does not always hold to what it says it's going to do or not do. So we don't know if that will be true. Right now, that looks like the best case scenario. As an attorney, I identify worst case scenarios for a living. So I will say that the worst case scenario right now looks like the State Department rescinding or reissuing current valid X gender marked passports. A very worst case scenario would be ordering federal employees to confiscate them. That, again, the thing about worst case scenarios is that they are unlikely. But if you are going to be traveling with an X gender marker, it's a good idea to do so with a safety plan. So I'll talk up for just a second about what goes into a travel safety plan, because you'll hear Kita and I say this throughout the presentation. So essentially, travel safety planning, what we recommend is a few things. First, pre-arrange an emergency contact who is ready to reach out to your congressperson and to a lawyer, right? So if your emergency contact is going to be your best friend, at home, then make sure that your best friend is prepared that if you contact them saying, I've been stopped by TSA, I'm not being allowed to board my flight, here's why, that person is designated and knows that their job is to contact your local congressperson for assistance and to contact a lawyer. We'll have some referrals at the end. Don't travel with anything that would attract any extra attention. So just check your stuff, double check your stuff, just so that you're not flagging on anybody's radar. Practice asserting your rights with TSA and with Customs and Border Patrol. So do some role plays with your friends where you're practicing, can you tell me why I'm being stopped? Can you tell me what about my document is improper? Can you tell me why you're looking in my bag? Can you please tell me, am I being detained? That is my favorite phrase, because if you're not being detained, you are generally free to go. I would like to talk to a lawyer. I do not consent to you searching my bag. All of those things are helpful things for you to have practiced so that you can feel in your body what it feels like to say when you're stressed out. And then bring a spare phone battery, because in worst case scenarios, and what we have learned from the 20 years or so that we've been subject to really intense scrutiny when we travel, and particularly people of color and Muslim people who are traveling and are often targeted, is that you often are detained and you don't know why and you don't know for how long. You want to make sure that you have a spare phone battery with you so that you are able to keep your phone. And one final thing is just, this is just a good rule in general to protect yourself, is that your phone should be set to put in a password or put in your PIN. If you use facial recognition or if you use fingerprint recognition, you can be compelled to open up your phone to law enforcement. They cannot do that without your consent or a warrant if you enter in a passcode. So those are just some very basic, like, make sure you've got yourself buttoned up and you're ready to go if you have any concerns. Okay, X-gender markers on state documents. So as of today, Washington State has not announced any changes to its rules or processes for issuing birth certificates or driver's licenses or enhanced driver's licenses with an X-gender marker. So those are still available on the state level. Some important things to know is that, like, you do have to provide your birth certificate to prove your citizenship when you're applying for a passport. So if you have an X-gender marker birth certificate, you are going to have a difficult interaction and are probably going to be told that you need to provide alternative documentation for your passport because they won't issue it in an X. And another thing to know is that if you don't yet have an enhanced driver's license, it is going to be required for any domestic plane travel starting in May. And I'll talk about that more soon in a later slide, because that is an important tool that you do have available to you. So some options in terms of how to navigate X-gender markers. If you feel comfortable and it's important to you that you travel with the documentation that you have as the person that you are, go ahead and travel with your X-gender marker, enhanced driver's license or passport. That is a perfectly legit thing to do. You have the right to exist. You have the right to hold those documents. And if, I think it's good to be prepared for how to navigate if you encounter any resistance. But right now, there isn't a rule that says you can't. So go ahead and do that. If you're less comfortable with conflict, you can amend your X-gender marker, enhanced driver's license, or your passport to a binary gender marker and travel with a little bit less attention. You can also, if you anticipate that there will be future changes that you're going to need to your documentation and you have an X gender marker on your state issued birth certificate, you can amend that back to a binary gender marker birth certificate if you think that you're going to need to renew your passport or do something different, or if it's not in alignment. So please know that you can go ahead and do that. And please do hang tight, because at the end of this, I had some really helpful conversations with Washington State's Department of Licensing and Department of Health today. And I have some more detailed information to share at the end of this presentation that I just, because it all kind of came together this afternoon, I didn't have time to weave artfully into the slides. All right, Kita, it's all you.
I should probably unmute. Okay, so I think an important thing to start off with that I also have further along for those folks who are already panicking. We have not heard, and our national partners have not heard of any issues traveling with current and valid passports, no matter the gender marker on them. So that includes X passports. We have not heard of any issues at any points of entry or borders. And so at this point, which is how it should be, at this point, those are currently valid, those that are currently valid have not had any issues. We would certainly want people to reach out to our national partners, and we're going to be listing resources here at the end. If you do have any issues traveling with a current valid passport that does not need renewal, there's no other issues going on, and that seems to be targeted only because of the gender marker. But I think to help folks feel a little bit better, if you have a current valid passport, that should be treated like a current valid passport. That said, all pending changes to gender markers are currently on hold. Many of you have reached out because you sent your passport off for renewal and you see that your documents are under review. That does not necessarily mean that you will not be getting your passport back. As I said, all current valid passports are being honored. And the reason that there is this pause and the reason that things are under review is because of what Denise explained about the executive orders. Executive orders exist to tell agencies what to do, how to change policy. And so the reason that there is this current pause is because these various agencies are updating their forms and updating their rules. That said, unfortunately, there is no beating the system at this point. I know when this first came out, people thought, oh, if I rush, maybe I can get it changed, or perhaps other things will go through. Unfortunately, and very sadly, the passport agencies and other agencies are on the lookout and are being very aggressive with any gender marker changes at this point. It is nothing that is going to sneak by. What is not clear is when folks who have requested a gender marker change will be getting their passports back. And if that becomes an issue and you find yourself in a situation where you have no passport and it's an emergency in terms of leaving the country, I think, we encourage people to reach out if you can to the passport agency, if you can show up at an office locally and say that you need that passport. But even more so, every single federal representative's office, so whether that is the House of Representatives or the Senate, so your senators and representatives have constituent assistance services, and this is who you need to go to for these things. You also can obviously reach out to some of the attorney resources that we'll list, but again, that is for people who are going to need that passport back before we know when it is they'll be returning them. At this point, from what we've seen, if they were to start returning them tomorrow, we anticipate that folks looking for a gender marker change would just be getting those passports back with your assigned gender at birth. That is what we could anticipate seeing at this point. Again, we noted that today is February 5th because the 6th things could change. And obviously people have a lot of different scenarios in terms of which documents they submitted and things like that. So it sort of really just depends, but that's what we would anticipate at this point. New applications are a little bit of a different story and have, some possible other considerations. I don't know if whoever's doing slides can go ahead to the next one. I'm not reading from them, so hopefully things on there are helpful for folks. Interestingly, the administration has taken down the newer passport application that obviously included an X and has reverted to the application from 2020. That application, though it is binary, does not have an attestation. So in other words, doesn't make you swear about anything regarding your gender. So theoretically, if you never had a passport ever in your life and the gender on all of your other documents that you are submitting is aligned, the passport agency should not know what your gender is other than the documents that you are presenting to the agency. In Washington state, if you receive a gender marker change on your birth certificate, it does not say that the birth certificate has been amended and it doesn't give a date of issuance. So there's nothing there that would alert the passport agency that your gender is anything other than what is on the documents that you are presenting to them. Now, again, that is for new passport applications, and they have been on the outlook and very aggressive in terms of any gender change issues that they see coming up. But again, theoretically, a new application means there's no information within the system for them at this point. According to our partners, our national partners who have been talking to people at the State Department and at the Social Security Administration, the current administration cannot currently see old documents that have been submitted, like your birth certificate. But they are very actively trying to see those old documents and figure out whether they have been scanned in the system or how it is that they can access them. If we want to go now to the renewal slide. What they can see and what we have heard reported back from people is that they can see information that has been submitted under a prior passport. Obviously a name, and if your name is gendered and was gendered previously in a way that it would make it clear that there's been a gender marker change. They're also evidently able to see gender and therefore see if there was also a gender marker change in addition to a name change. So because of that, if you are looking to renew your passport without a gender marker change and just straight up renew it, just sending it in, well, first of all, don't send it in. We'll get to that in a minute. But if you're just straight up trying to renew it, there are a few different things that we are seeing. For folks who've gone in on an emergency basis to change a passport in person because they are traveling within 2 weeks, which is almost always the only scenario for an emergency change to a passport or renewal, excuse me, to a passport. We are seeing that folks are getting a passport back, but they are getting a passport back with their assigned gender at birth. So the administration is in the business, evidently, of gender marker changes because they are changing the gender back to what was originally in their system, which for folks is their gender they were identified with at birth. In one, there have been a bunch of different scenarios, and I have no doubt that all of you have seen various things online and in community, and I think there's a lot of different situations happening. I think, frankly, they're probably all true because for a minute there, before Marco Rubio put out a memo to sort of tell people, look, just put a hold on all of this, agencies were doing a variety of things. At this point, there should be a hold on any changes. And people should be getting issued emergency passports. There was a brief moment there where we saw someone who had just documents, frankly, seized and not returned, but then who was able to advocate for themselves through some of the means that we mentioned, representatives going back themselves, reaching out to national organizations, who was then able to secure a passport, but again, in their, not in their gender, in their assigned gender at birth. A lot of you have documents for renewal that have been taken for renewal and are in process, and that might feel as if they've been seized because we don't have a timeline yet. But our understanding at this point is that you should be getting a passport. We just don't know the timeline yet. And again, could change tomorrow. So those should be coming back to you. But at this point, if you sent something in and you had an X and you previously had a passport, or if you had a gender marker change and something was previously reflected on your passport as being a different gender, you should anticipate and prepare yourself that you will be getting a passport back with your assigned gender at birth. We did have one report of someone going in, they said for renewal and had documents seized and were able to get their birth certificate back, but not the other documents. That's something that's being followed up on. It's literally one case in the whole country. And so we're trying to understand what happened there and why they weren't issued at least a passport in their assigned gender at birth. There is a sort of interesting situation with the old passport form for X noted that X is either an unspecified or other gender. And so what we would urge folks to do is if you are looking to renew and you had an ex, I would just not offer up any information that you don't want to offer up. You know, it could be that you just chose not to identify, but just note that if you have an X on there, it might be a way to get a renewal under the correct gender if under your correct gender if there's no information there. I know people, this is a lot, I know, are also very concerned because for some folks, for many folks, your gender marker is not going to reflect what you look like. And so folks have some concern there in terms of how their passport will be treated. The concern is, excuse me, the concern from TSA or anyone who's looking at it is that your photo should be your likeness. Your photo does not have to reflect any particular gender, or any gender at all. It is just you. That is who your photo should reflect. And there should not be any correlation that any agent or anyone examining your passport needs to make between your photo, how you present, and what the gender indicates. So even if you are getting back a passport where you look wildly different than what we would assume one would look like with the gender marker, and what someone at some point of entry might think that someone should look like, it does not matter. It just has to look like you. And presumably, unless you're an identical twin, there's no one else who looks like you, and that's all that it should be looking like. To that extent, let's go ahead and move on to children, to your lovely kiddos, those beautiful, lovely, scrumptious, eat them up. If you're a teenager, my apologies. You are totally mature and not eat them up scrumptious. But um, I think the first most important thing to know here for parents is that this is an opportunity, because some of you may not, I should back up and say, parents of trans and non-binary children may not be in queer and trans community. You may not have the history of resilience and strength and ingenuity and mutual support that this community has and will continue to have. And so it's an opportunity to not only share that with your trans and non-binary children, but to also tell them that a document does not define them. The people who lack creativity and freedom to see beyond a binary and cisgender world don't define who trans and non-binary people are and have always been. We have always been here. We will still be here after today and into the future. And that is the most important thing. Many elders in our community are certainly concerned, but have lived through a time of very actively not having any document identify them as who they are in any way, shape, or form, and they are still here and they are thriving. That said, important things to know about children's passports. Everything I already said also applies to children. There are some specific things that also apply to kids that I think are important to remember. Under the age of 16, you must go in person for any renewal of your passport. So doesn't matter why, if you are under 16, you have to go in person, which obviously can present either an opportunity in terms of your gender marker or a hindrance, depending upon what your current passport says and what your documentation indicates. If your child has an X on their passport and has never had any other passport and all of their other documents indicate a binary gender that is their gender, you might receive a passport in the correct gender instead of the one that was assigned at birth. This is where at the beginning, we indicated there are sort of these general rules and provisions we can give you and what it is that we're seeing. But I think particularly because folks have used X a lot more in the last few years, and particularly people with very young children who might have chosen X at their birth for them so as to not choose a binary gender, We just don't know what is out there and how the administration will treat things. Um, Again, on the old passport form, X was listed as a, unspecified or other gender. And so you may have been a parent, frankly, who has now a cisgender child with an X on their passport. And we don't know how that will be treated in terms of whether there will be scrutiny there of those documents simply because it started as an X. Or not, because all your documents align. It just remains to be seen. And I want folks to just be smart and diligent about thinking through what it is that you want and what it is that you need. I will say in general that the most important thing I've heard from a lot of folks is that they just want a valid passport. And I think that is very legitimate. And that is also a great choice, and that they do not care what the gender marker indicates. And I think, again, each individual situation is to a certain extent an individual situation. To that extent, I want to make it clear that this administration is certainly one that does not shrink from going after people and from retribution and from seeking people out. We are only 2.5 weeks in, and that seems very clear. So I would also really caution people to read through forms carefully and be sure what you're presenting is not fraudulent. Again, the current passport form for new applications for passports does not make you attest, as of this afternoon when I checked, that the gender that you are presenting is your assigned gender at birth. That's as of right now. That could change. I'm guessing it probably will change. And so you want to be cautious that whatever you're submitting in a truthful manner and not fraudulently, because again, this administration, I can imagine, would pursue people. Overall, our big takeaway, our very strong advice right now, is that if you have a current and valid passport, do not try to make any changes to it. Hold on to that passport. There is no guarantee that you will get it back, that you will get your documents back, or in particular, what timeline that will be on. And I think, frankly, that's probably the most concerning thing right now for folks who are in passport renewal and who even submitted it before this administration began. I know someone who had one, I think, under review as of January 3rd, which was a little bit surprising, that the prior administration didn't get that moved through. But regardless, the hold on to something that is current and valid, because every passport right now, from what we have heard, is being treated as current and valid. Make copies of everything as you normally would. Make sure you prepare yourself for any type of travel. And again, each person needs to think through for themselves. Do you want to be stealth? Do you want to go unrecognized? Or are you fine and happy to make it clear who you are and potentially have to spend more time, at a point of entry? But again, you should be allowed through that point of entry if that photo is a likeness of you. The last very important thing to note is another reason to wait is things possibly could get better. We have seen all of these issues from executive orders, almost all of them at this point, be litigated. It's possible something could change, and could change in a good way. So if you do not need to renew, if you are not traveling within the next 2 weeks, if there's no emergency happening, just hang tight. The other thing that we would note, sorry, yes, sorry, just making sure I noted this. If you do have to travel immediately, as Denise already indicated, make sure you keep copies of everything, and pass them on to someone else who is a trusted person to back you up. The last thing to note is that our national partners in litigation are still seeking plaintiffs who are intersex around potential litigation for passport issues. So we have listed out some partners at the end. If that applies to you, and if you would be interested in being a plaintiff around these issues, and again, specifically if you are an intersex person, please reach out to the ACLU and let them know that you would be interested in being a plaintiff. Otherwise, I believe that is all that I have, unless I missed anything, which I hope I didn't. Denise, please talk to us about Social Security.
All right, not having my most stellar tech day, I gotta tell you. Okay, so Social Security. So this was a sort of a sleeper thing that came in at the very end of last week. So for a minute, Social Security was allowing name and gender changes to continue, even notwithstanding the executive order. So you might have seen that folks were able to process them in the first week of the administration. That has stopped. Social Security has now frozen all applications for changes to the gender field in Numident. So what is Numident? It is the numerical identification system that num is numerical, ident is identification, and then system that Social Security uses. And it's how it pulls together all of the data from birth records and death records from all across the country, and then generate Social Security numbers and all of the other pieces of data that come along with that. So the important thing to know is that Numident has very specific data fields. So the only change that has been frozen is changes to the gender marker in that system. So name changes appear to currently be unaffected and be able to be completed. It does help if you can have everything aligned names if possible. Because what we don't know yet is really how the non-alignment of names across agency records will impact you. So, I think that sort of goes to what Keita was saying a minute ago about sort of the unpredictable nature of how all of these things are being rolled out. Is that there's we just a lot of it is like who you talk to on a particular day, and in what way you're interacting with the agency. So for example, in IRS records, you actually only need to have technically need to have the last or the first four letters of your last name and your Social Security number, as long as the Social Security numbers match. But, that's not that's the bare minimum. And you might be encountering federal employees that ask for more than that. Or it sort of is the thing that calls attention to you. One thing I wanted to note is that for folks who don't know this already, you must change your name. If you do get a name change, you must change your name with Social Security before you update it on your driver's license or enhanced driver's license, or it will return a mismatch. So just know that for yourself. Name changes, as I said, unaffected, and unless you are encountering a particularly discriminatory federal employee, it shouldn't matter if the gender that's typically assigned to your name matches your gender marker. And so I know a lot of folks have concerns and communicated questions about name changes in your questions for registration. Just know that to our knowledge, name changes are not being affected, and remain very possible to get, and remain changeable on these documents. And you do want to have alignment just so you're not, so that you're not, for example, trying to board a flight with a ticket in the wrong name as the ID document. So just know that you need to change your name with Social Security, just your name. If you change your gender marker on your driver's license or enhanced driver's license, you do not need to have that updated with Social Security. It is only, remember I said Numident, there's sort of the gender field that is frozen. The name field is fine. And also the only field that is cross-referenced between Social Security and the driver's license is the name field, right? And so they're not cross-referencing your gender marker. So you can change your gender marker with the state of Washington on your state documents, and it will not flag with SSA, only a name. You don't have to, I went through the SSA name change process last night just to see kind of what it looked like these days. And it didn't look like they ask you for a reason, but just in case, you don't need to tell SSA anything about your name change. You can just say you like the name better, right? You are not obligated to share your status or your personal desires or reasons for the documents that you hold to anyone. So you just don't need to tell them anything about that. That's also true for what it's worth on legal name change orders with county courts here in Washington, is they do ask for a reason. You don't have to provide any particular reason. You can just say you like it better. Although sometimes if you say it's because of a gender related reason, the judge will congratulate you sometimes, because our judges do like tend to like name changes. So let me talk a little bit about enhanced driver's licenses. So enhanced driver's licenses, for folks who don't know, an enhanced driver's license is essentially a driver's license that you get from your state Department of Licensing that where in order to get it, you have to align it with, you have to show proof of citizenship, and you have to show some proof of your identity. So it's essentially like a citizens only driver's license. So importantly, Washington has some ability for non-citizens to get ID cards and other licensing, which is great. But an enhanced driver's license is one that allows, it goes through a citizenship check process, and then it is essentially like you get a new driver's license that sort of looks like your old driver's license, but it has like, it's like a little bit of a different color and has a different heading. Starting in May, Washington residents will either need to have a passport or an enhanced driver's license to enter federal buildings or to travel by plane. Importantly, an EDL also lets you enter Canada right now. So just know that this remains an option in the event that, and I'll just forward this. This remains an option in the event that you do need to travel, and for whatever reason, you either are waiting to get your passport back from the government or from the federal government, or you have another issue with your passport that feels like it's preventative for you to be able to use it. You can travel to Canada and travel on domestic airlines, enter federal buildings with an enhanced driver's license. So, obviously we hope that that is not necessary, but it is good to know that you've got that. So in Washington, enhanced driver's licenses, they are state issued documents, and by statute, states have the authority to define the gender marker on the document. Now, statutes are not magic. They can be changed by Congress. So it is possible that Congress could change that law down the line. But for the time being, Washington is still in charge of deciding gender markers on enhanced driver's licenses and is still issuing X gender markers. And it's all one form. If you've done your driver's license, it's the same form on your enhanced driver's license. It's just the little self-attestation form. Obviously, as we've talked about, we don't know how TSA, Customs and Border Patrol, or any other federal entities are going to treat X gender markers, and whether their rules around it will change. Again, they have said that they will honor valid documents with X gender markers, but we don't know yet if that's going to be true. So keep that in mind. If you don't have an enhanced driver's license yet, you should be looking at getting one relatively soon, if at all possible. And then I think now might be a good time actually for me to do a quick report out on what I learned in some conversations with Department of Licensing and Department of Health today. And this is really important. So Department of Licensing is the state department that issues driver's licenses, enhanced driver's licenses, and then a wide range of other licenses like car titles and things like that. Um, and so, so that's Department of Licensing. Department of Health issues birth certificates. And so in both of those state agencies, Washington was a national leader about 10 years ago in ensuring that people can both change their gender markers and adopt an X gender marker through self-attestation alone. And that was the result of many hardworking state employees, as well as many hardworking community advocates who really like made this process of self-attestation possible and expanded these definitions for our state documents. And so I know one of the concerns that folks are holding, because you've told us, is like, if I have these state documents, is there interaction with like federal databases on the back end that I don't know about? Kind of like we mentioned, the name mismatch between your driver's license and Social Security, and needing to make sure that you update your name with Social Security. You know, that's sort of a trap, right? It probably didn't occur to folks that, oh, Social Security is going to look at my driver's license, right? And so, you know, I know a lot of folks were like, are there other back end issues I need to be aware of? So I had conversations with both representatives from both agencies today and learned some really helpful information. The biggest thing is that there's really only 3 or 4 databases that they use that have interaction with the federal government. And those interactions where they're sharing data with the federal government happen according to very specific contracts that allow for the distribution of very specific data for very specific purposes. So it's not a like, you know, it's not like everybody gets to like look at the same Excel spreadsheet, right? So for example, some of those contracts are Social Security Administration has a contract with Department of Health. And so when someone is born or when someone dies and their birth or death certificate is entered by the state, that data is shared at the time of birth or death with Social Security Administration, so that the Social Security Administration can either provide a number and card to a newly born person, or can close the number and any benefits that might be received by the person who has passed away. And it's really very limited to those specific functions. Importantly, Social Security, or excuse me, Department of Health does not update Social Security when you make a change to your birth certificate. So when you're born, your birth certificate gets sent to Social Security with those specific data fields for your Social Security, for you to get your number and your card, and collect some demographic data and things like your name, so that they do that name database of which names are most common and things like that. But if you change something on your birth certificate, they do not send Social Security a new update on your data fields. So if you want to do that, you have to do that yourself. So that's an important thing to know. There is some interaction around law enforcement that again is really limited to to law enforcement specific arrests, convictions, charges, things like that. And then any other data requests, there's another one around CDC, a contract with the CDC and Department of Health that's sort of unrelated to stuff with gender markers. It's, things like, why did someone pass away, or was there a birth health event? So other data requests can only be obtained from the state by agreement or by subpoena, right? So what that means is that if the federal government comes to the Department of Licensing and the Department of Health and says, we want a list of these people or people with this demographic category, they are essentially treated as anyone else, right? It would be like if I went to the Department of Licensing or Department of Health and said, I want this data category. And so unless there's a contract between the state and the federal government to provide that data, where there's an agreement, or the data is subject to public records, which is not, not the case for this type of information. And unless there's, or unless the federal government subpoenas the state agency, they are not going to be able to get that data. For folks who don't know, a subpoena is essentially a court order that says that, the state agency or whomever is the target of the subpoena must, under penalty of law, turn over certain pieces of data. And you have to have a very good legal reason in order for a court to order that. And you have to have a signature from a judge. So these are not sort of willy-nilly kinds of things. A subpoena is a really big deal. And so the sense that I got from Department of Health and Department of Licensing was, we are not inclined to agree to anything that the federal government wants us to give them. We are very aware of the potential purposes for how the federal government may be using these kinds of pieces of data. And we are on the lookout for subpoenas. We're not, those are things that we take very seriously and definitely have us on alert. And they have recently had cause in the case of a request for Medicare and Medicaid records related to a fraud investigation where the federal government wanted data, and they said, no, you're going to need to subpoena us. And the government and the federal government ended up backing down on that. And so I think it's really important to know that this is not sort of free moving data, that there's really strict protocols, and that the state is like very clued in to what's happening here. Additionally, the data that the state collects tends to reflect current data, not historical data. So if you make a change to your gender marker with Department of Licensing or Department of Health, there's not like in their systems, it doesn't show it used to be this and now it's this. It just shows today it's this. So that's another piece of information that's helpful. And then the other thing they really wanted folks to know is that their systems are really not set up for broad phishing campaigns, nor are they interested in supporting something like that. So, even if they wanted to, the systems would make it really difficult to do mass sort of identification of folks with different, trans, non-binary, intersex folks with other sort of document challenges. And they're like, the systems are just not set up to do that. So a couple other things that I wanted to look at. One thing I did want to flag that they wanted me to flag for y'all is that Washington now has a law that allows you to obtain a sealed name change. And QLaw Foundation has represented folks and successfully obtained retroactive sealed name changes. So please do use that process if you would like to get a sealed name change. And the benefit of a sealed name change is that it creates an entirely new record. It sort of like eliminates any original record. So for example, if you got a sealed name change and then you got your birth certificate updated, there would be no record of your old birth certificate. There's no such thing in their data systems as like the original birth certificate. They basically said like, yeah, that's not really a thing. And if you get a sealed name change, the entire thing is replaced by this new field, and the old one is gone because you can't have a link between the two, right? Because it's a sealed name change. It's designed to not be able to track what the current name is and the former name.
Sorry, can I just jump in and say that's not something a court's going to challenge you on. The law is specifically set up for trans folks. So this is like a normal process to seal a name change now in Washington state. This is not going to be jumping through hoops. It's not going to be something special. This is just normal, everyday thing the court can do for you.
Yep. Yeah. And we'll have a resource for you on that towards the end. Thanks, Keita. So the last thing I wanted to share two important things that the folks that I talked to at Department of Health and Department of Licensing wanted me to share. One is I know that folks are very, very concerned about the time frame on Department of Health website about birth certificate changes. And, you know, until recently it said 10 months processing time. It might even still say that. Um, what's important to know is that the folks that I talked to today who are like, you know, the big wigs, they were very generous with their time. Last weekend, they processed 500 pending gender changes on birth certificates. Um, they really deeply recognize how important this is, how these documents are not just administrative sort of pieces of paper floating around, that they are parts of not only our identities, but they are parts of the administrative structure you need in order to move through your life with the most safety you possibly can. And they take this incredibly seriously. And when I heard 500 were processed last weekend, it was like an all hands on deck thing. And I was just, you know, I've been in community for 25 years. I remember when you got your driver's license changed by like hoping you passed well enough to convince the person at Department of Licensing that your gender marker was a typo, right? Um, and I remember when it was incredibly difficult to get taken seriously by these entities that have so much control over these pieces of paper that we have to move through every single day of our lives. Um, and I was just very touched to see this this group of state employees really, you know, this is years of advocacy by our communities and really really open-hearted state employees who have really gotten to a point where they truly understand how serious this is. So they are fast tracking these changes. And so if you have an emergency need, I really do encourage you to reach out to Department of Health for birth certificate stuff, Department of Licensing for driver's license or enhanced driver's license stuff, because they understand what's happening. They are very aware, and there are specific liaisons within state government that are working on and researching and planning for the interaction between state and federal laws and state and federal policies to anticipate exactly these kinds of issues. Um, the last thing I wanted to share was actually really sweet, is that the state employee, one of the state employees that I talked to, who is sort of at the crux of a lot of this work, said, you know, we can't put on the uh you know, we can't put on the state of Washington website like dear trans people, we love you, right? um because they represent all Washingtonians and there's all of these restrictions around that. But they said, you know, when we undergo these processes, when we, you know, when we work through these changes, when we anticipate these things, when we are working with people to get their documents aligned, like this is how we say we love you, because we know that you are flooded with messages of hate right now. And this is what we can say to say, we love you, we care about you, and we want to do what we can to make this easier. Um, you know, there's a lot of nuance right now in terms of um, not being targeted, and not sort of creating targets. Um, and I think that everybody's navigating that in their own way. And so it was just very, it was very interesting to me and powerful to me to see these folks really truly internalizing how important this is and how important all of you are to them. So, you know, at the end of the day, I know that interacting with administrative agencies is a form of oppression. I'm not trying to like, you know, Pollyanna you right now. but I will say that to the extent that we are all living in these systems of oppression, you do have people who are kind of clocking the horizons for what's coming and are paying attention to that and are educated and ready, and planning ahead and acting in protective ways around our data so that they're, to the degree that the federal government desires to target our communities, they are going to encounter every possible obstacle in doing so. Okay. Protective document practices. This is just a sort of checklist for you. Again, please do not send your passport into the federal government right now. When it's a good idea just to have color and black and white copies of all of your documents saved in multiple places, give backups to your trusted friends. This is just again, we're attorneys, we identify worst case scenarios for a living. Just have extra documents kicking around. If you are one of the people who has done a second parent adoption with QLaw, you've probably heard me say, your adoption decree for your child, your birth certificate, your passport, your driver's license, all of these things, they're not documents you need on the best day of your life. They are documents you need on the worst day of your life. So make sure that there are many copies and that they are with trusted people. Make sure you read forms carefully. Kita covered that. Assume your passport history is findable by the federal government, so don't try and hide that. It is what it is. And then in the event that you have a contact with federal employees, or with local or state officials carrying out federal duties, this includes law enforcement. I was talking to somebody about a county clerk issue today, where we're seeing sort of like things popping up where folks are being told things by employees that don't appear to align with what the law should be. It's important to document those contacts. What did they say to you? What were their instructions? What did they cite to? It's okay to say, can you please show me or point me to the authority that you're relying on to ask me to do this? Record the interaction with consent if you can. Write it down if you can't. And then if you do have an issue, report it to our state attorney general's civil rights unit. They are actively tracking these issues. Local advocacy organizations like ACLU of Washington are also actively tracking this. And then the national organizations, and particularly ACLU National, is also actively working on these documentation issues. So please do make sure that you are, don't be afraid to report these things, because it's very often that that you are not the only one who is having this issue. And it is, the more, I know that it's sort of our community's pattern that, because you're so often not heard by systems of power, that the people that you tell are your loved ones and your friends. And I really understand that and have lived that. And I will say that that we are at a point where there is pushback, and so we just, it's helpful to tell these agencies, advocacy organizations, what's happening. Okay, individual help. So if you are somebody who's like, I need to, like, I have an X in this and an M in this, I'm not sure how to do this, or how do I find the forms? What's my best course of action? You might have other ancillary things like a criminal record, or or disability needs, or other communications issues. Everybody has their own situation. And so if you need individual help, QLaw Foundation has attorney consultations that will be reopening this month. Northwest Justice Project, their work is income limited for representation, and you can call their clear line on the numbers on this slide to get connected with them. They do have a very knowledgeable group of lawyers working on specifically on identity issues, as well as this is sort of ancillary to this issue, but they also have very knowledgeable attorneys working on family law as well as benefits, public benefits issues. So Northwest Justice Project is a great resource. And then also you can go to washingtonlawhelp.org. And they have pulled together all of the different documents that you need, including, as we mentioned, the sealed name change court documents. And you can also reach out to Northwest Justice Project for help with filing those documents, again, if you income qualify. So washingtonlawhelp.org has a wealth of really helpful information and forms and instructions, and they have a specific identity document situation. National Center for Lesbian Rights. It is Kita and I's personal favorite option for folks who are not in Washington and are in other parts of the country. They have an incredibly robust attorney network. They have a helpline. My law school bestie and one of Kita's early mentors is the supervisor of that helpline. So shout out to NCLR. They, despite the name, they have led on trans, non-binary, intersex issues for a long time. Really fantastic, and their helpline is really robust. So that's how to get individual help. Final note is how we can help each other. You know, fear is really contagious. Anxiety is really contagious. So please, as you're sharing out information, please make sure that you're just taking a moment to research and fact check what you're reading. Share specifics, not generalizations. So I've seen this not just within our community, but also in some of the ICE raids that we've seen, where people will share a post that says like ICE has been spotted in downtown Seattle, right? When you share very general information like that without specifics about who, what, when, where, it's sort of like calling 911 and yelling fire. Like you've advanced the ball like 1 yard, but like it's not information that's super useful, right? And so when you have something that you want to share out and let people know about, just make sure that what you're sharing is accurate and that you're sharing in specific ways and directing folks to resources, or sharing directly what you've learned with advocacy organizations. Kita, do you want to do the quick?
Yeah, you would pick it up from here. So the other thing I'd say is that we know people are all over the country and are looking at examples of places as to how things go well and are protective. And that is Washington State. But the reason that is the case is because of decades of advocacy from queer and trans folks, allies, but frankly, mostly queer and trans folks and our organizations. We would love more allies to join us. To that extent, QLaw is still doing that type of advocacy today. So, for instance, currently in this legislative session, there are 4 different bills targeting trans youth, some good, some bad. QLaw has been very active in getting out information, having the public, all of you, come and testify, submit testimony separately, write to your legislators, has been organizing our community around these issues. So this is not just a past issue, but a current issue. But I really want to emphasize the reason that we got to where we are today in Washington State is not simply because we have some great folks who ran for office. It is because of decades of work. As Denise said, when she and I started out 20 years ago in our legal careers, a lot of these protections didn't exist. These have been protections that have come around during our tenure as attorneys. We have seen those protections come through the Department of Licensing, and therefore have those employees that we have now who are so great and protective and who are forward looking. Same thing with the Department of Health. Same thing with the courts, all across the board. The reason these protections exist are because of queer and trans advocacy. And so frankly, the best thing that you can do after you sign off tonight is to donate to QLaw. Denise and I are both doing this on a completely voluntary basis. I'm sure that for both of us, it felt like a part-time to full-time job over the past 2.5 weeks. But we love to do it because we want to support our community. We also support our community by giving back to the organization that we volunteer for. The folks who are here keep us going, got this platform together for us. I could not have presented this to you all tonight without QLaw. I do not have this platform. I do not have the ability to create all of these things. So we need you to donate. We really do. And we need you to share this with friends because we are a volunteer, largely volunteer-based resource that needs some folks running the ship so that we can make sure to bring you all the information that we have and keep you up to date. There is a link there in the slides. I believe that there's also one that has been listed down below. Again, our legal clinics are starting back up again this month. We had a pause to restructure them to be sure that we can meet the needs of everyone and as many people as we can. So please feel free to reach out. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. This is a really scary time. This is a really scary time. And I really have to rely on our elders who have been through previous really scary times. The advancements that we have seen are recent. The X on the passport is just a few years old. That is not ancient news. I mean, you have preschoolers who were the first to see those, right? This is all relatively new stuff. And we want to fight to keep it that way. We want to fight to keep Washington State being a protective state. And we've got to participate to do that, but we will make it. We will make it. We are going to take some of the questions. I should have said that before the pitch to keep people on. And by take questions, I mean go through some of the questions that we had submitted from folks. We did cover a lot of the questions that were submitted, which was very helpful. Thank you all for submitting questions so that we knew where to focus and what people needed to know. Denise, did you want to call out any of those particular questions that we didn't get to in the presentation?
Yeah, and actually I did want to correct one important thing. Shout out to Ronnie QLaw's outstanding legal programs director. I want to make sure I get your job title right, Ronnie. When you are getting a sealed name change in Washington, you do have to tell the court that it is because of gender or there's a couple of other reasons, including significant risk of harm. Excuse me. Okay, hold on. Specific reason including domestic violence, gender expression or identity, emancipated minors, or asylum. So you do for a sealed name change, just because of the way that our public court system works, you do actually need to articulate one of those reasons. If you're just getting a name change in regular schmegular court, then which is district court here in Washington in your county, you actually don't have to provide any specific information. So you can just say you like it better if you want. It's just for sealed name changes. It does have to be for one of those reasons. Thank you, Ronnie, for that correction. Okay, so a couple of questions. So here's a good idea, or a good question, just to kind of reiterate. For documents where you don't have the same name and gender marker change across the board, so your driver's license says this, your birth certificate says that, your passport says something else, should folks be fixing those documents to match or align, or changing them for the first time in order to have them match or align? What I would say is that for federal documents, the course of action right now is that you're essentially stuck with what you've currently got. So if that's Social Security, and you don't have a passport yet, then your documents should reflect what's in your Social Security record. If you have a passport in a particular gender marker, your state documents should reflect the gender of that passport. the thing that you want to think about it in terms of like, what's the document that you need to use? And so, in particular, if you hold an X gender marker, you might want to be really careful to figure out what you want your passport, or what you think your passport is most likely to be if it changed from an X gender marker, and then change your state documents to reflect that, so that you've got everything lined up in order to easily change your passport to whatever marker it was in previously. Because remember that the passport area is both the most limited and a document you really need, and is also where they have the ability to look at historical data and the desire at this point to be looking at historical data. So your safest course of action is to, if you have an X gender marker on your passport, is to figure out what you're most likely to have your to have the federal government change it back to, and then align your other documents to match that. But again, if you are not coming up on a renewal date, or you're not coming up on an expiration date, and particularly if you either are fine traveling with your X gender marker, or you want to, or you don't have travel plans coming up where you're going to be needing to interface around it, just hang tight, because at least for another couple of months, until we see how things shake out, until we see what gets challenged successfully, until we see what the rules actually look like, right? Like there isn't like deep urgency to do that. Now, that might change in the news tomorrow, right? It is February 5th at 7:37 p.m. and I have not looked at my phone for the news in like 4 hours. So, so do with that what you will. But that's sort of where I think we are at.
I did hear that question as do my documents need to align is a little bit more where I was hearing. And I would say they don't. They do not have to align. I think that you need to think for yourself how things feel moving in the world. When I heard Denise say, you need to think about what they will most likely move the X to. Most likely, if you had a prior passport in a different gender and they think they can identify that as your assigned gender at birth, that's just what it's going to get changed to. I mean, frankly, we're not sure yet, but you might not have to do anything. You might just on a renewal end up with, hey, we found your old passport and that's what we're putting it back to. But there's no requirement that your identification be aligned. There was a period of time where you could have, an X in the state and you could not have that on your passport. And so those documents were not in alignment. So you are not required to have the documents be aligned in terms of your gender marker, if that is where the question was going.
Yeah. Enhanced driver's licenses and real IDs, are they affected by the new executive order? And can they still be used to travel outside of the US? We covered this, but it bears repeating because the passport situation is so uncertain. So enhanced driver's licenses issued by the state of Washington are not affected by the new executive order. By statute, which has to be changed by Congress, which will take much longer than whatever President Trump decides to write on a piece of paper and send to the press. The enhanced driver's licenses are governed, their gender markers are governed by the state, and Washington is committed to keeping both changes and X markers available. Can they be used to travel outside of the United States? Yes, with the caveat that it is only Canada. And again, that might change. If you watch the news this week, you may have seen that we had a small tiff with Canada over tariffs. To be honest, I didn't follow it with any more complexity than that. Tariffs are not my bag, but for now, you can enter Canada with an enhanced driver's license, which can reflect your lived gender. There was also this reminds me that there was this really beautiful a op-ed in the Washington Post earlier this week from someone who holds an X gender marker and who talked about how having an X gender marker had actually made their life much easier in traveling. And sort of describe the experience of like, having a gender marker that actually accurately reflects how I present. People look at me and they're like, MF, what am I seeing here? Right. And that having an X gender marker actually sort of just gave people an answer of like, oh, neither, something else. um, some other, galactic abundance that I have never encountered before. And great, and it allowed this person to move more safely through their life. And so I thought that was a really beautiful perspective to be elevated right now.
And if I
So
could just jump in really quick and say that, I would just have folks watch or pay attention to what's happening with the X markers for re-entry to the US, because frankly, I think that entry into Canada is going to be less an issue than re-entry to the US with an enhanced driver's license that says X. Now, again, we won't get into all the legalities, but if the federal government should be recognizing a state identification that is up to federal snuff, even if it has an X on it, for you to re-enter the country. That should not be an issue. That would be a big constitutional issue if it were. But, since unfortunately we are seeing some people decide to go ahead and, comply before there is an actual law, just if you are choosing to do that, to travel with the enhanced driver's license that has an X and you're planning to go into Canada and come back to the US, just sort of be aware, give yourself some extra time, maybe check that there haven't been any issues occurring. Again, there shouldn't be, but I would have the concern be more on re-entry than in entering Canada.
right. Yes. There's a question. I think I'll do I actually wanted to say one other thing about enhanced driver's licenses that I forgot earlier. And then we'll do one more question. So enhanced driver's licenses, the thing I forgot to mention is it's, so as I said earlier, the implementation date for requiring use of an enhanced driver's license to fly even domestically, any flight kind of going through TSA, entering federal buildings, that transition under the Real ID Act, it starts May 7th, but what TSA has said to Department of Licensing, to the Washington State Department of Licensing, is and what's in their implementation plan is actually kind of a rollout period. So it's not like there's going to be, like an iron thing that comes down on May 7th, where if you don't have that specific document, you need to just like take your bags and go home. The rollout plan is essentially like, we'll start by telling people, hey, FYI, you need to get this document. They may start communicating with people who have used the document to travel, to like send them something in the mail saying you need to get this new document. And so this is like a rollout period of a long time. Again, things can change.
I was gonna say, that surprises me.
Look,
Be generous. I'm not really. Okay.
I'm just saying what TSA said.
That's great. TSA said that. My advice as an attorney is get it by May 7th or assume you're
Right.
not boarding that flight,
Right.
because
Right. I just don't want you, I just don't want you, if you've like, if your grandma is sick and you need to go
fair,
visit her, I don't want you staying home. Right.
fair,
But
fair.
yes, get your EDL, please. And last question is, the safety of traveling with kiddos that have X gender markers or are trans, and, kind of navigating that. And I think this is just a good point to reiterate is, with kids, you just really want to have the conversation with your kiddo about the experience they're going to have, particularly if you're traveling internationally. um you know, every time I've traveled with my child internationally, he has been asked like questions by TSA and by the border agents, right? Usually it's, where did you go? What did you do? Is this your mom? Right? And variations on that theme. And I had to kind of prepare him because he, when he was like, oh my God. So I had to kind of prepare him for like, okay, you're going to be asked a couple of questions. Keep your answers short. It's okay to answer. Don't be scared. You don't have anything to hide, right? And I think um, walking a child through the presence that they in this the centering that they need to have for themselves in that interaction is a good idea. Certainly, if you yourself have documentation that is either an X marker, or that, if you have a photo, a marker that doesn't match how you look, and you're worried that you might be having interactions, you also want to make sure that you prepare your kiddo for that with some age appropriate conversation, and that you leave plenty of time, and that you have some emergency contact folks ready in case there's a delay, right? You just want to just kind of give yourself a little bit of space, give yourself some backup just in case a worst case scenario occurs. Travel with your adoption decrees, travel with your kiddo's birth certificate, that says that you're the parent. If your kiddo's birth certificate does not reflect the same name that's on your identity document, you should change your kiddo's birth certificate so that they align, because you want to make sure that you are verifiably your child's parent at any interaction with TSA or with border agents. And so those are just some practices. We don't, your kids are going to be traveling with the passports that they have. Again, we're in this sort of limbo period. So if you've got travel coming up, particularly, you're going to need to kind of do some family preparation. But we can't guarantee the safety of people interacting with any law enforcement agency, particularly TSA or Customs and Border Patrol. So just just use your best judgment, and you don't have to be scared. Just be strategic, do some practicing, and just make sure you have the resources available to you that you need. Um, and you probably won't need them. That is our deepest hope.
The one thing I just want to add here, Denise, is that I think the thing that we've seen most recently before, for instance, the gender marker changes just stopped, the change just stopped happening, is agents who don't know what to do. And so a lot more time being taken. And so I think, at this point, everything we know is that if your child or you have a current and valid passport, it does not matter what the gender marker is. That might take some agent a minute to figure out, like, oh, I heard this thing. Are we still accepting this? Let me go ask my supervisor, blah, blah, blah. So just give yourself more time. Let your kid know it might take more time. Um, Again, you should be let through, no problem. It shouldn't take more time, but there might be an agent who is just, something sparks in their brain, and eventually you're going to be let through and it's fine, but it'll take you just that much longer. The other thing that I'll note is I can't remember at what age domestically you need to even show any identification when you're traveling as a minor with a parent, but you shouldn't have to show anything domestically for quite some time, which frankly is shocking to me.
Yeah,
um,
I think that's right. But I will say that particularly because they don't have to show anything, they do when you're moving through the little, I don't know, I'm not fancy, I don't have pre-check or whatever, so I stand in the long line with all the rest of the peasants. And so when you are at the point where you're with the agent, and you're scanning your thing, and you're showing your boarding pass, but right before you head into security, that is the point where they pause and will often turn to the kid and say, like, are you X, like, what are, where are you going, et cetera. And it's usually only like maybe 2 questions. And I think it often, sometimes it just sort of, I don't know, for me, it just threw me off because I was like, why are you talking to like, don't talk to my child, right? Like, it was just like the mom hackles. So I think,
My point is, if your child happens to have any type of documentation, you shouldn't need to provide that, is my point.
right,
So that shouldn't come up domestically. To that extent as well, and I'll just say briefly, since you mentioned TSA pre-check, that nothing should change there in terms of gender markers. You get background checked for that. That is, based on who you are, not your gender marker. The same thing for Clear, that uses biometric data. They're not necessarily going to be looking at any type of gender markers there. I didn't check with them on this. I want to be clear. But when you go through, what they look to scan are it's a retinal scan or it's a fingerprint scan. So it's not that they are cross-verifying gender, they're cross-verifying physical biometrics. So hopefully those should not have any issues, and we would want that reported out if there were issues.
yeah.
And I think that's all that we have.
It is. Thanks for hanging in, folks. Please, again, consider donating to QLaw Foundation. We really appreciate all of you, and we're happy to be here, and keep in touch. And we, as I always say, as a lawyer, I hope I never have to talk to you again. But we're here if you need us.
Thank you all very much for attending, and this has been recorded, and so please do feel free to pass it along if folks have questions. I have no idea if we will be able to or when we might do an update of any kind, but just try to keep yourself informed and reach out to those resources we provided if you do have questions. And stay safe and live joyfully. We are a joyful community, and yeah, that is the most important part. Thank
All
you.
right. Good night, fam.